Good morning to everybody. I hope everybody had a real pleasant summer. Humid, hot, crummy weather. But other than that, I hope you got some rest and time away from all this. And by the way, I've had some comments about this bottle I sometimes have here. I'm not trying to sell Hood milk, but it's always empty, full of water. And so it's my way of keeping hydrated throughout the day, and I have to refill it 2 or 3 times. So I encourage people here to bring, fluids in here and whether it be a cup of coffee or water or
You need something
tea.
like this.
Exactly. I need something like that.
Flask.
Yeah, what do you have in that flask?
Water.
Oh, okay. We've had those in the past, not on this committee. Had a little bit more than H2O in the flask. So I'd like to, just before we get into our discussion today on 354 and on top of that, school building aid. It's a huge topic which we have before us here, and it's critical. It's a costly program, but it's also, I feel, that fourth leg of instruction and learning. We need to have schools which house the facilities necessary for the chemistry labs and for the classroom space, for the conference rooms, for special education, on it goes, and keep them current. But I'd like to just before we get going on this, for the committee here, to explain some of the things which have gone on in the last couple days and this week and previous weeks, so that you can be up to snuff and I can get a little feedback from you. One of the things I did do on, let's see, this is what Thursday was, when on Tuesday night there was a meeting over at Concord High School dealing with the ED 306 rules. And I had an opportunity to attend that particular hearing. They've been, these rule revision, which we've talked about, which is really very critical and important to the minimum standards for public school approval. Have these hearings been occurring throughout the state, and if school districts request them, this meeting was requested by the superintendent at Merrimack and Concord, and it was attended fairly well. I thought there must have been about 50, 60 people there. The issue, though, Fred Bramante, who is the previous chair of the school board for our state board of education, was there and presented. Following that, there's some questions and some issues which were brought forward. And I indicated to him, we are concerned that there's portions there which may be contrary to current statute, but also are eliminating some of the key elements within subject areas and curriculum. Would he please be open to meeting with the Legislative Oversight Committee or the Education Committee? He said he would very much like to do that. And so what I'd like to do with the members who are here is try to find out, this I think we need to do right off in October sometime. And so are there any dates within October which would be good for us to try to get together, have Fred in here and walk through have him, present to us, and then for us to have some open Q&A with him, and which he's very much open to doing. So looking at these little things right here.
You got October 2nd, we got one.
Looking at the week of the 9th. Okay, let me get in here first, okay? I gotta remember my code here to get in this damn thing. Okay. Okay, looking at October, folks. What are the dates that are open for you? I'll just jot down some of them. And I know that like on October 2, we have I think a subcommittee on 437 on that date.
Right.
And there's also a CT advisory council at approximately the same time in the morning. So that doesn't, the afternoon's available. What else do we have?
Afternoon's not available.
Not available. Okay, so Tuesday.
Because you've got the teacher shortage.
Oh, is that the teacher shortage on that one too? I don't have it in my calendar here.
Well, we just scheduled it yesterday.
Okay, I got to get that in there. Okay, the week of the 16th is really kind of loaded for myself. I have 18, 19, 20, a lot going on with the University System of New Hampshire as a trustee. So that's not good. But I'm pretty much open in October.
How about the week of the 9th sometime?
Yeah,
What was that date, Glenn?
the week of the 9th is, what do we have for open on the week of the 9th?
It'd be good if we could do it later in the week,
Okay, Mel, what,
like the 12th.
that's totally open for me.
Well,
You're gone on the 13th, but the 12th's good? Good. So let me call Fred up and I'll say we could meet with him on the 12th. And then I'll get back by way of texting or emailing you, letting you know if whether it's the morning or the afternoon, what Fred might be able to do.
Full committee or just us?
I'm going to open it up to the Legislative Oversight Committee and the Education Committee.
Do you want to invite Senator down?
Well, Ruth is on the Oversight Committee. I'm going to let Ruth
Yeah.
decide whether she wants to invite in the full Senate Education people. Ruth, by the way, was there on Tuesday night. She had to leave early to get back up the highway, but she said, I'd like to hear more about this. So I'm sure they'll be there too. So the 12th. Okay. Okay. All right. Is there anything else that we have to go over? There's been a lot going on. We've had the teacher shortage meeting going on. We've had the disillusionment group for the charter schools. We've had the EFA Oversight Committee meeting. We've had yesterday the Commission for Civics Education over at Granite State. There's a lot going on. A lot of issues are percolating, and it all comes down to dollars and cents. And so I'd like to get right now, if there's not any other issues on it, and looking at 354 and explain what we'd like to do today. At 11 o'clock, we do have a Zoom coming in with Joel from the Education Commission of the States dealing with school building aid. So I'd like to take a break shortly at right around 10:30 or so thereabouts for a short time for the technology people here to come in and set it all up, and where we can stand and wander a little bit, and then sitting down 3 hours in the morning is not the best thing, healthy thing we should all be doing. So in the morning, what I'd like to start out right now is you do have a copy of the some minutes I wrote. These aren't official minutes. The subcommittees, we usually don't have them, but I wrote down some of the thoughts immediately following what we did in June 12, 2023. And there's on that page, the following handouts attached were provided committee members. We had a copy of 354. The list of issues needing resolution, and there was like A through I, and probably a lot more issues were brought up. Welcome, Jen. How was Alaska? Was it really? What time did you get home last night? Midnight. Yeah, that. Yeah, the red eye's hard to take out of there. Well, welcome back, and we'll keep you awake. The list of issues needing resolution, A through I there, are not all of them, but is there a way to fund smaller projects alongside or separate from larger projects? This is looking at school building as a total, not just the charter school issue. How do charters fit into the process? Building support for emergency projects. We have emergency projects that come up throughout this state, and it could be a charter or it could be a regular school with arsenic in the water, or a roof that's leaking. Where's the funding come up for that? Those are emergency situations. I'm sure Amy has some ideas on that. Do security and severe safety issues need special prioritization? What is the process for previously listed applications if said applications are denied? So do they flow over to the next year? Do they go to the top of the heap? Do those projects go to the top of the list in future considerations? Should the state share of grant awards be offset by sale of facility, property, equipment, et cetera, from older facility? Or does that go back to the district? And G, identify funding methods that ensure long-term sustainability and identify source of such funds. That's a big one. H, should a flat funding per pupil grant system be considered, strengths and weaknesses of that? We did have a proposal, as you recall, before Division 2 last year that was put forth by Representative Hull of having a flat funding scenario. That's something that I'm sure it's not going away. It's coming back at us. The Senate's already putting forward legislation in that regard. How do the following criteria conditions possibly impact flat funding, community property values, family income, projected grade levels and proposed facility, geographic location, demographics, etc.? It all goes on. Should 80% of the state grant be provided immediately or in consideration of a lesser percentage divide over the length of the bond? Those were some of the issues which were brought up in conjunction with where we are. I have taken the time to do some exploring and working with some spreadsheets here, which I'm going to pass out in a little bit here, that came from, the ideas came from ECS and some of the other states which we have out there, and also based upon what we had presented at Division 2 last year. But the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about HB 354, and the purpose of that was to provide funding for charter public schools. I'd like to try to identify clearly some of those issues which would impact the funding of these schools at a 30% level. So I want to open it up right now to a discussion here as to, why we should do this or why we shouldn't do this. What are the weaknesses? What are the strengths? What needs to be resolved through legislation? Any thoughts on it right now? Or are we all coming in pretty cold on this topic?
Well,
Right.
I think that when we had the initial discussions on 354, we found that there were inconsistencies in the statutes related to whether funding should be available to school funding, school building aid funding should be available to charter schools. So I think that, that's the point that we start from really on this. And my consideration is that they're public schools, so I think that I would side with the statute that says they are eligible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the direction we should take.
Yes.
Rick, in your discussions with the dissolution of a charter school, was there conversation about the allocation of the assets, of where the assets go from that charter school?
When we were here talking about the dissolution of a charter school,
Yeah.
it was an organizational meeting, and Senator Lang is now the chair of that committee. We did not get into that discussion. It is on the list of things to do.
Because that would be one of the concerns that I'd have. I mean, even if we did provide funding for them, where do the assets lie? Because you've got an independent nonprofit basically running the school, and particularly I think if the school is from the school district. I mean, there was an article in the paper yesterday regarding the lakes, in the lakes area where you had a school building that was going to be going to a charter school. And the question that I was having, as you begin to retrofit the building, there's a cost for that. I'm assuming there's a certain amount of startup costs that the charter school does receive from the federal government, from the state. And so just what happens, it's just a question of what do we do with those assets if in fact there is a dissolution of that particular charter school?
And they're going to be looking at that.
Yeah. If I could?
Yeah.
I think there was general agreement that there needed to be some structure laid out for dissolution plans. They're pretty much boilerplate, it seems now, in the charter school application, which is a requirement. But for instance, I think with the charter school, you're thinking of when they submitted their application and were approved, they did not have a building. Now they have a building. So, I would agree that the dissolution plan should be revisited in those types of circumstances because it's changed completely at this point. There's a purchase of sale agreement and so forth that outlines some things, but I think we need to go back to the application and revise the dissolution plan in those circumstances. And I think DOE indicated that they had looked briefly, and other states don't seem to have too much in that regard in terms of dissolution plans either. So, but they are in full agreement that the committee should head in that direction.
So if I may follow up with Glenn. So Glenn, are you saying that the DOE right now is beginning to look, because we have what? How many, we have 4 or 5 that have their own building?
7, I think.
We have 7, and in this packet, you're going to see that I handed out, there is a communication which we got from DOE regarding that. And let me get that, see if that memo is in here. Yes, it is. It's from Tal Bayer. Is it Bayer? Amy? Amy, why don't you, we're going to be talking DOE, and you have that computer on your lap there. Why don't you just come on up and sit right at one of these mics at the table up here? Because if there's others who want to testify, they're going to have to replace. Amy, why don't you just come up and just be, we've done this many times when we are asking the technical support from DOE just to participate with us. That way you can, yeah. But the communication that you see, it's this sheet right in this packet of material. When I did communicate with them, and this is from Tal and Caitlin Davis. It says there's 21 schools that lease. There are 11 schools that own, and 3 schools have not opened yet, but will likely lease. There are a few, of the 3, I think there's 2 that are now open.
I think they're opening in
Next fall on the road, and then the other one is
That
not.
sounds correct. There were 2 that opened this
Yeah.
current year. Yep.
And so if you look at the sheet just below that sheet that I'm referencing right now, you can see the names of the schools and the population within those schools over the, remember, when we're looking at a charter school, we're not looking at ADMR, we're looking at ADMA. When you do your school building aid, Amy, you look at the average of the last 5 years of ADMR.
That's correct, but it wouldn't apply here anyway because that's to calculate the building aid rate,
Yeah.
where charter schools are just a flat 30%, so we don't actually apply the calculation at all.
Yeah, and so, but if we were to use a student population number in there for the grant that comes to was 30%, whatever percentage we do, then it would have to be an ADMA rather than the ADMR, because they don't have because they have them from different districts, but they do have attendance.
Correct, but just keep in mind that if you were, I guess what you're saying is, if you were to put them in the building aid calculation, we could use ADMA instead of ADMR, but the other factor in there is median family income.
Yeah.
So we'd also have to solve that problem. The building aid rate is a function of those 2 things, median family income and equalized valuation per pupil.
Right, yes. Yeah, that impacts the 30 to 60%. I
Correct.
get that. But if we had a flat rate of 30%, irregardless of ADM
Correct.
or regardless of median family income or the other, just it's a flat 30%.
Just flat 30.
And if we had the population, would it be an average or would it be of the previous year?
It's a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Of course. It actually isn't really that complicated. It's a ranking. So it's a ranking where you fall within the state. That's why the building aid rates don't change very much, even if median family income changes or equalized valuation per pupil, because it's where you rank within the state.
Explain that a little bit more.
So the building aid calculation is essentially the median family income.
Yeah.
You rank all the municipalities. Then you find the equalized valuation per pupil using ADMR, and you rank those. And the average of those rankings, you enter a table. So like, let's say if you were number 1 in median family income and you were number 20 in equalized valuation per pupil, that's where your rank is. You would average those. I should have picked better numbers, but the average of 21, which is 10 and a half, you take that number 10 and a half and you'd enter the table to see what building aid rate you fall into. There's bracketed rates for what they call the building aid factor.
Okay, I understand that. I thought you were talking about the ranking of the applications.
Oh, no, the
Okay.
ranking
Okay.
of median family
Okay.
income and
Okay.
ranking of equalized
I get
valuation
with
per
it.
pupil. Yeah.
So, the answer to the question, I believe there's 7. Is that correct? 7 owned?
It sounds right, but I'm not sure. I don't.
Yeah. Well, according to this memo right here, it's about that. So the disillusionment and there's a lot of issues. Do you give building aid to a would you give building aid to a charter school if the building they're in didn't meet life safety, fire safety codes and
No, not only do charter schools would not receive building aid, they also wouldn't be occupying that for student occupancy. So it's not really a question about building aid. It's that they're a public school and have to meet all the same regulations. Similar with private schools. Private schools have certain safety regulations that they're required to meet too. Public schools have more requirements, but they wouldn't be operating a facility if they did not meet their life and health and safety requirements.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is just take a second and explain this packet of materials I just gave you so that this is,
It says 11 schools.
pardon me, 11, are you still looking at that?
So that it says
1,
7.
2, 3, 4,
Right at the
5,
top,
6, 7,
Schools
8.
that own, it says 11.
Well, 10, right? Owned. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Chris, the child care system was virtual learning academy. I'm not sure that's excellent.
Yeah, see, that's,
That's probably on purpose because they don't have, it's virtual, so they don't have a building for students. Yep.
okay, the second sheet going underneath this one identifies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 charters. And it lists their ADMA for since 2018 through 2022. I went back 5 years simply because we go back 5 years for the other side as an average. But that's ADMR. This is ADMA. The highlighted in black is the average of the 5 years. The lighter color below was on the first one, like the Academy for Science and Design, which has 528 kids in it. The average is 526. If we use the average of 5 years, the average for 3 years would be 529. And if you use the most recent year, which would 2020 would be 528. So that's what the lighter color is. The lighter color is the average of 3 years. some of them don't have, for example, if you come down to Gathering Waters Charter School, it's got an ADMA for the 1 year, 2022. So that, if we used a 1 year, that would be sliding over there and that's what we'd use. But this lists what their populations are. Some of those are pretty good sized schools with over 500 kids in them. So the number of kids that are in the 5-year average for own charter schools is 1,409 kids. And for the 3 years is 1,446. It's very, very close, very close. So, and then if you were to add in the one that has just the 1 year, it'd be a little higher. I don't know, I didn't see anything for Benjamin Franklin or Hartwood Public. Pardon me? They just opened? They just opened. So obviously, this is a growing list of schools and facilities. Amy, when we have these new schools coming in, what's the process that the DOE does to recognize them when the state board approves? Do they ask about the facility itself?
Unfortunately, I don't know. Tal takes them through the school board approval for charter procedure. For the facility approval, which is separate because that happens after, you can't get a facility unless you know your charter is going to be approved by the state board. So after they have a charter that's approved by the state board, if they want a facility that's approved, then they go through our facility approval process, which is making sure that they have an emergency operation plan on file, that they have their certificate of occupancy, and they have a approval by the town. They don't have asbestos in their building. They're testing their water, drinking water for lead and things like that. Representative Black, can I, is this the table that you were going over just now?
I hadn't started
Okay,
yet. I was
okay.
gonna, this is just an example, has some numbers in there which, are not solid, but it's a concept which we're gonna have something very similar coming at us, only not using any square footage to all based upon population from the Senate. So a lot of issues. Let me explain what we got here in front of you in this thing so we can go through it. This is the sheet that looks like this. And this is in regard to both charters and public schools. I went through and looked at other states and I kind of latched on to the state of Tennessee and several others which have a formula which is sustainable and predictable. One of the issues which we have with school building aid right now is that you saw the list we had come to Amy, where there were 17 applications in the last go around. How many did you approve? 3 or?
2 have been approved and we're waiting for the next
Waiting for the
year
next.
for our other funding.
So all these school districts, in order to get that application in here, they've had to put forth a lot of dollars with architects, with engineers, trying to get this application in so it can be looked at as Amy does. They have to put forward $70,000, $80,000 easily. And they're saying, we didn't get an award, but we had to put forth all this money. And yet, by the time we get an application approved, which might be 10 years from now, that may have to be done again. So they're saying, and the people in the communities are saying that's an expense that is difficult to get approved through the voters, to go do that site plan, site design and all that, which is done through architects and engineers. So what the idea I think that J.R. Hull was trying to present, and that was one which it was a very quick amendment and there was a lot of holes in it and we couldn't go with it. But he was trying to come up, can we do something that's more predictable? So a school district knows that they're going to have X number of dollars available and they can plan for that 10, 15 years down the road. And that is a type of formula that I'm trying to do something right here with. I'm not necessarily sold on it. I'm just presenting it to us for discussion purposes only. So the formula has in the spreadsheet these columns A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and the bottom. If you look at formula going across, and we have extras of these if people out here want to have a copy and follow along with us. Yeah. And there's a few more right here as well. Glenn, if you need more of them. Okay, everybody, I think probably has a copy right now. So looking at the first column, A, that's just your district identification number. Column B, as you're going across the spreadsheet, identifies the community or the school district. This is exactly what we have in current law, the districts right there. The next column across is your ADMR for that school district, and it's an average of the 5 years prior to this. So that would give you a pretty accurate understanding of what your residence student population is like. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Amy.
You're doing good
Okay, so far, okay.
so far.
Okay, then in this particular, yes,
It's on the chart, but on your,
that's referencing charters.
okay.
Okay, so this is right now, we're jumping to a formula which would be for the regular right here. If it was the charter, as you even looked in the proposal was put forth by Representative Hole, there was another line, and that's in the back of this handout which you got. His amendment was, yeah, it's amendment to HB 2. It's there, and you notice that he has on line 14 through line 16 the ADMR for the school districts, but notice it's ADMA on line 20 and through 22 for the charters. So it's like apples and oranges there.
Yeah. Is it-
So you would, well, and he had it that you would get 30% of your ADMA in the bill that for his flat model.
So there's a couple of variables, the three or 5 years.
That's a variable. It's different than it would be for the districts. That's what I'm trying to go through right now.
Okay.
As you're going across the spreadsheet, D, what I did is I looked at what they had years ago down in Tennessee, not years ago, about 5-6 years ago, cost of construction. And the cost of construction was based upon square footage per pupil. Now, I've used, just for ease of doing this, I took an average because the cost, if you took square footage per pupil for an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school, they're different. And some of the differences that they have in law, that was in that report that I looked at, was that the elementary per pupil square footage was used back then was 105 square feet. For the middle school was 110, for high school was 130. I went through and calculated the percentage of kids in the state which are in high schools, 9 through 12. It's about 33% of our student population. And K through 8 is the other. And so taking the average of these numbers, I came up and used the figure 114 square feet. It could be changed. Any figure you want to use, you can use. But that's just to get this concept across. So that square footage was multiplied at 114 square foot per pupil, and at $153 per square foot. The cost in Allenstown, for example, for the cost of their project would be $9.5 million. But there's other costs which are part of this other than just the building a building with a contractor. And the other costs include costs for equipment, which is put inside the building. So an additional 10% was put on there. It's on the front sheet. Architect fees, 7%. And there's a 20-year debt retirement at 6%. So it takes care of the debt. So it's a total of 123%. It's 100% for the cost that we have there in the column D, let's see, well, the one that says 9.5, that column. Multiply that by 123%, the cost of that building would now be $11.7 million. It's a district which gets 60% based upon their rate of median family income and equalized valuation per pupil. 60% for the state multiplied times that 11.7 million would come out to $7 million spread over a life cycle of 40 years. The amount that they would receive annually would be $176,049.81. Annually, that would go to the district. The concept we're looking at, this money would not go to the district. It would stay in a building fund controlled by the state treasurer. And the interest would go back into the pot that this money is constantly gaining. The purpose of this whole money is for renovation and construction. I'm not changing the rationale or that we use currently for building aid. And to access this money, it's there for the towns, but they still have to complete their application that with meeting the criteria and the standards. And that would go through DOE, and DOE would then authorize the use of that money from that fund that's theirs over a period of time. That's the basic concept behind this. If you look at the bottom line on this type thing on the fourth page, the cost of this for the state would be $38 million annually. We also have a debt or a tail, which we're paying off and saying it's roughly $25 million, $24 million, somewhere around that neighborhood. Adding that on top of appropriating $50 million isn't going to do it. We'd have to appropriate somewhere closer to 60 something or $75 million to get this thing going. And there may be some money left over in the pot. I know I'm going through a lot here, but the money that like the interest money gained could be used for emergency projects, projects which need immediate attention that the state recognizes need to be done. This is a concept which is very similar to what Senator Lang is bringing forward. Only I don't think he's using the square footage and all that. This formula right here would, if it's done properly, would even break it down for square footage by the number of kids that are middle, elementary, and high school within each district. Yeah, Cassandra.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat again what the 38 million total signifies? That's if you funded all those projects? No?
Yes, annually. And of course, it would change over the years based upon population,
Right.
shifts and the averages there. But this is what you would get, for example, let's look at Berlin.
Right, we're at 60%.
You're at 60%.
Yeah,
Going across here. So you would receive each year $349,113.26.
right. And the town would have to come up with 10 million, so I'm just looking at the two.
And you have to come up with the state share for your project.
It's about 13, right?
No, your project would, total cost, additional costs would be $94 million.
No, that's Bedford. just look down one,
Oh, okay, excuse me, I'm on the
Yeah,
wrong line.
23.
Yeah, 23, yes,
Yeah.
I was on the wrong line,
and
yeah,
the state would be about 13.
that's right.
So the city would have to come up with about 10. I mean, just to round things off. So that total at the last, on the last page of 38 million is that annual allocation that every single school district
Yes.
potentially would get?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
got it.
Based
Thanks.
on this formula, now, if you were to change it, for
right.
example, over a 30-year life expect cycle, you jump it by another $10 million. It'd be $48 million. That would be the mathematics involved, which we try, there's a lot of, anything you change in this is going to,
Right, it's gonna have a ripple
it's
effect.
going to ripple
Yeah.
effect across the spreadsheet. This is the concept that was brought up at Division Two,
Yeah,
but it wasn't as thorough as this, or brought in some of those conditions or criteria. So it's something that the legislature is probably going to be faced with, having to make a decision, how are we going to do this?
So this concept is basically creating a bank account for each school district.
Reserve fund.
Right, and the state basically reserves that money until a school district says, we want to build a project.
Yeah,
Is that
and you
correct?
could have some small districts saying after 2 years, well, I want to do this. I want to do this maintenance. Maintenance is
not
not
the same.
part of this right
All right,
here.
that's important.
So that's important. There has to be on this concept, there has to be some kind of a clearinghouse and an approval process. So you still want to be building according to the standards that we expect for a schoolhouse to be.
Rick, just a question. So the assumption is, so I get this right, the assumption is that over this course of these X amount of years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, every school district in the state will need to build something, even though if they don't now. Is that the assumption, the way this is written?
Yet the life of a building is.
I'm not suggesting it's wrong, I'm just saying that's what, to make sure I'm on the same
concept.
page.
That's the
Okay.
concept.
Okay.
The
thank-
other issue
Thank you.
is, does this money go into a reserve account within the school district, or is it held outside and all of it invested? So then from that you get interest, and you could,
You build a
with
pot.
that bigger pot, and that would pay off some of our debt faster for the state. It also would, any other of that surplus interest, and there would be with that amount of money accruing, that would give that option for emergency applications.
So, under this plan, could one school district borrow money from another school district? I'm serious. I mean, if one had, we don't have any building plans for the next 5 or 6 years, and we've got this pot of money here, so sure, we'll loan it to you, assuming that when we get ready to do some building, we might be able to borrow it back from you. I mean, it's just a question whether or not that's part of this plan, or is it just singularly identified per school district in a big account? Because I think the float you're talking about of $38 million or whatever it is a lot more than 13. So I think, so that was just, I'm not raising this to be funny, but I'm just, because I know somebody's going to think about that.
Oh, yeah, sure, it's like going down the black hole here, but I think that it would have to be for that school district, and before the school district's gonna be able to access their pot of money, they're gonna have to demonstrate to DOE that it's paralleling the standards and criteria that we expect a schoolhouse to look like, and they see that it's not just maintenance or custodial type work, it is truly renovation, and that those standards we have currently in place.
Yeah, I would assume that it is just per school district, because you
Yes,
can't
yes.
go Rob and Peter to pay Paul here.
I think the question also would play into, is that money kept in the state account?
Yes.
Or in a local account? If it's a local account, you know,
Oh, no.
who knows?
No, if you go into this kind of thing, it's got to be held in the state.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
Amy, what are your thoughts on this whole, I know you've had this whole thing presented. We went through it last year, the concept.
So I would just keep in mind that this process would be excellent in 40 years because a school will have banked enough money to potentially have a construction project. But for example, in Berlin, that example, that $13.9 million that you pointed out, just keep in mind that that's not going to be available for 40 years. The account is going to get $349,000 for 40 years. So that means for a real construction project, $349,000 is not going to do anything for community.
No.
The actual construction costs for a total project run about $500 to $600 per square foot. I realize there's a 23% addition here in the calculation, but so for New England, for our projects across the country, they are not at $114 per square foot. So like, I realize this is a table and you can plug in different numbers and it's a concept, but when you start talking about a total of 38 million, we really could be talking about 3 times that, really could be talking about 120 million or so.
I get that.
Yeah,
get that.
I understand. I just want to make sure other
The-
people understood because there was a question about the 13 million, like running this process parallel to a process to assist schools that haven't already been built, their buildings are already 70, 80 years old. So it just, for me, it makes me nervous because it feels like a little bit of a delay for 40 years before you get something actually up and running. But running it in parallel, I mean, the concept ultimately is great. Had we thought about it 40 years ago, so why not start now? I'm not saying why not start now? That's great. Just I'm thinking it probably needs to run along a parallel program to fund schools now.
Yeah.
That was the criticism that it was brought forth. I think.
The transition period of getting to where you want this thing functioning is going to take a lot of time. And there's issues out there we know that need attention, but we're not addressing them either now under our situation.
Right.
We 3 possible projects out of 17. And I've talked to several superintendents. Their biggest concern is predictability. How can I, and sustainability, how can I predict I can do this building here this year? And that it helps the voters understand that too. So under our present situation, it's a crapshoot. You submit your application, you may or may not get it. So
And then the only other thing I'd say is there probably should be some kind of price index each year because, if you delay a project 1 year, you're probably already going to lose $349,000. On these, our projects are coming just for like scale. We're talking about a $20 million project is a cheap project these days for a small, we're talking about 20, 30, 40, 90. We're Maine, because that's a good comparison. Maine, Massachusetts isn't always the best comparison, but Maine is already building schools over $100 million. So just like scale wise, obviously it depends on the type of school and the number of students there, but we're still talking about large projects. So just keeping in mind that scale, that's all I would say.
that scale is important. I built a school up in Alaska. It was at that time $96 million. It's a high school. We had oil money to do it, but it's over $90 a barrel today. So we have buildings like that in this state too that are potential for that. That would wipe out what we're doing in our present formula. We would never be able to accomplish that with 80% up front. So we have a quandary here as far as how we're going to handle this.
So Amy, as you look at your spreadsheet or whatever your Ouija board you use to look at this stuff, how is there a differentiation between new construction vis-a-vis that of renovation? Is there differentiation between priority as far as a new building vis-a-vis a retrofitting an older building?
No, there wouldn't be a priority. And I'd say more and more communities are, and cost wise, it used to be, people thought it would be cheaper to do renovation, but that's not always the case. The costs are really relatively similar. And so there's a big push to focus more on renovation, not from the department, but just globally or community-wise. It can be more sustainable. Schools are used to having that building in their community and they're attached to it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're saving money or not for renovation versus
Thank you.
new.
Yes.
Just a quick question, what do you consider the life cycle of a building?
Yeah, 40 years is good. I mean, 40 years is 40 years is what the data shows to say that after 40 years, you're looking at some significant deterioration of a building, of a school building specifically, of that type of building.
So I think the concept is good because I think if you look at big picture, it's like, okay, New Hampshire needs to invest in its school buildings. I mean, I have a school 98 years old and the other one 51 years old. And with the biomass going down the tubes, we'll never come up with $10 million, you know, raised locally. But if there was some plan that we knew down the road, I think 40 years is a long time because then you got to start almost all over again, don't you? If that time were a little bit shortened, and I'm watching Littleton that's gone through that, you know, this process for years,
Yes.
and Colebrook going through it, who knows, maybe years, you know, who knows, right? But I like the idea of the investment in our buildings for our kids. Because like I say, they vary all over the state, and I really wanted to get a survey out, find out how many schools actually had that double vestibule entrance for school safety. Because I know ours do not, because we never could generate the local funds, you know, to be able to do that on a 98-year-old building. But I know there are a lot of other small towns that have particularly older buildings, and they're the hub of those communities. But I do like that concept of looking at that big picture so that there's hope for every district.
That's what I hear from a lot of superintendents. They're looking for predictability.
Amy, just go, can I go back to a comment you made? Rick's chart's predicating the numbers on the 114 square foot, right? Is that right? And you said the average cost in New Hampshire is 500 to 600?
Correct, for the total project cost. So
Right,
that would,
right.
I think in the table, it's 114,
Right. That'd be,
153, and then there's a 23%
Right.
bump. So
Yeah.
$180 a square foot is what this table
but you're,
shows.
basically you're talking 3 times that.
Approximately.
Yeah, in ballpark. Okay, so these numbers would be 3 times that. Okay, thank you.
Also, the square footage is 114 on the table, and our state average that schools cannot meet in design is approximately 140 square feet. We're really closer to 180. It does depend elementary, middle, high, but that 140, we have not seen a school be able to meet that with the special education spaces that are needed and keeping class sizes down to closer to 20 than 25. I'm not sure about Tennessee, but in New Hampshire, the 20 is where people, the schools are kind of
So
floating
you,
at.
if I may, Rick, so you're saying 140 would be the minimum or 180?
Minimum would be 140 square feet.
But they're not meeting that threshold?
It varies. I'm trying to think of the numbers. It's got categories of, the smaller your school is population wise, the more square foot per pupil you need, because you still need a cafeteria
Okay.
space, you still need a
Okay.
gym space.
All right.
But I would say the average is between, if you wanted to use an average, 150 to 170 or 80. The range though is probably 140 to 200. Like if you wanted to think like, wow, 120 square feet per pupil, that's a tight school. And they've got their spaces like probably really maximized. And then 200 square feet per pupil is closer to probably that school has a lot of special education or special services in their school districts.
Okay, thank you, Rick.
so one of the questions I'd have too on that.
Yeah, down here, down this end first.
Thank you. I wonder if this is kind of a multi-prong approach would be better, because I think of the schools that are in line for building ed, but they're number 4 or 5 on the list, and they come away with nothing. Whereas under this program, at least they'd have something in the bank. But we can't do, we can't fund both things at the same time with the pot of money that we have. But I wonder if we could tweak it enough that you could still move on, everybody could still move on, rather than depending on one source of funding, and that's that very short list every year.
Okay, yeah, the question I would have, how do you deal with the projection of student population when you begin to look at either renovating a building or building a new building? How do you know what the student population is going to be in 10 years, for example?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. In order to apply for building aid, you have to submit some statistical analysis of your projected population. Those projections in a lot of schools are going down. So we use whatever their current enrollment is for sizing the school. It is a little risky because there are some enrollment, if you are not talking about alternative types of education, enrollment could look like does come in waves. So there could be an uptick. I know that's not a popular statement, but that is what a lot of the enrollment experts say. But then you have to compare that with alternative types of education impacting public schools, and it's really difficult to project. So we don't see many designs. We see schools proposing for some increase in population, depending on the school district, but the state doesn't pay for that portion of that increase. We cap it at their existing enrollment numbers if they're declining.
Okay, now, what we also have to always consider is we have a debt we're paying off. On top of, for example, just going with the flow there, and let's say we had something where it was $38 million, which we obligate this year or whatever year it might be. In looking at the chart right here, we handed out the last one, the tail and the debt. For FY 24-25, the total obligations are close to 50 million bucks. So we appropriate $50 million supposedly each year. So that leaves $50 million left, but that drops off very quickly here. So if I go down, let's say to FY 28-29, the debt is $27 million total. So it's in the present formula, it's going to give us more money for school construction and renovation, but it's still not going to catch up with the needs which we have. With a formula like this, if the money were invested, and if you put 38 or $50 million in the pot or 60 million, you'd have to put 38 million plus the debt for, let's say, another 50 million on top of that to pay off the debt. If you're, it's going to come up more than what we are presently allocating. Anyway, I think you shake or bake this, it's going to have to be more money to start out. So you can build up that state pot, and the interest will then help accrue and take care of some of those immediate issues in that transition process. I don't have the figures in that because I haven't done that calculation as far as what the interest would garnish gain us. Yes.
Could I just put a reminder out there too, because I feel like this gets lost sometimes. That $50 million cap was put in place in 2013. And I just want people to remember that in the late 2000s, 2009, maybe even 2010, the state was spending over 60, maybe even $64 million per year at that time, before that cap, if you count the bond in 2010 when that started too. So like just thinking about the amount of money that we were spending was more back in 2009, 2010, 2011 than it is now is just something to keep in mind too. I think that kind of gets lost because the cap is there in the law, that it was a number that could be sustainable.
Yeah.
And then I also want to point out, since this is a work session, I did run some numbers for you all, because this chart here, there's another potential mesh with what you have here too, and that's that, keep in mind that the state, my bureau has all construction projects prior to the moratorium were funded through the Department of Education. There was no ranking list. They put an application in and the state funded that share. Okay, so again, I think it's very important to not lose sight that those projects were funded, all of them, prior to the moratorium. So because of that, we have a very robust list of projects all the way back. We have them in paper form back from the 40s and 50s, but we have them all in a database from 1970 and on. So if you kind of wanted to mesh this with a credit of some schools have already received some square footage, then you could do that. You could do something potentially like, if you got, I don't mean to make this too technical, but if you got so much square footage built last year, then that could come off your credit at 100%, right? Because it was just built last year. And then you could fraction that off. 1 over 40 is 2.5%. So you could take 2.5% and reduce that every year, which means that somebody that took building aid and built, you could take their square footage and reduce it by 2.5% each year as you go back. Something to kind of shift some of that money to districts that haven't tapped into building aid for a long time, and then shift less money to those districts that have received building aid in the last 40 years. And then the last number I wanted to put out there is that just again for scale, the state funded in over a 37-year period that happens to be from 1973 to 2009 before the moratorium, 27 million square feet of renovations and additions to schools. And that average square footage, I can put this all in numbers and I can confirm my numbers later, but that average square footage is about 700,000 square feet per year that the program was operating at that time. If you take that and multiply it by $550 a square foot, and you apply the average rate of 38%, you come out to be $154 million of state aid per year. So just giving you that kind of, the take-home math on that is, if you were to compare today's dollars to what the program was doing prior to the moratorium, it's approximately, in today's dollars, about 154 million. If you were to look at the last, since 1973 to prior to the moratorium. So some numbers, food for thought. I don't know if that confuses things or
in
makes
those
things
days,
better or
we were
worse.
funding all comers. You put an application in, it was approved.
Well, that's not true. It was approved under the regulations. Only projects that were eligible were approved. They still had caps on square footage. They still had caps on a dollar amount.
I understand
yeah.
that, Amy, but
Yeah.
if they complied with all the standards, the criteria, they were approved.
Correct.
Now it's not that way.
Correct.
And
Because
back
the
in those
funding is
days,
limited, right.
we were, in terms of the rest of the states in this country, funding at about the average level, around 20th or 29th, somewhere in that, of the states. Now we're nowhere near that. We're at rock bottom.
Correct.
So it has changed, and our debt was significant back then. It's $540+ million. So what I'm just trying to say is that I think we have come to the point where we got to do something here. There's got to be a transition plan. There's got to be some kind of formula, and we've got to help the school districts. Yeah, we have buildings that don't have our entry areas that are secure. We have Littleton Grade School, which is a 2-story building that's just in trouble. We got Colebrook right now that can't get the bonding done to do their school. So there's got to be some answers to this, and I think that we can't just keep tweaking the formula. And I know there's legislation you've given me to try to put forward here regarding the 10-year plan and all that and the application process. That's good. We'll do that. But somehow we've got to really shift our gears a little bit here and plan for more than just this year. So how to be forward thinking? We got to do something. This group. Now, in looking at this spreadsheet too, if you go to the next sheet beyond, if you took this formula and applied it to charter schools, there's one sheet that looks sort of like this in the bundle, like this. And I took a 3-year average. I should have just taken the last year of ADMA. But at any rate, you can see what the state share would be for those buildings, because there are very few of them. There's only like 7 or so I used square footage, not a whole lot of square footage. So the annual cost for the whole state, all charter schools, would be around $232,000 annually. And if you look at the last one of those, I put one in there for a specific school, Academy for Science and Design. They would receive $85,000 a year out of this pot if it's funded at 30%, using the same type of formula. So the charter schools are not going to eat a whole lot out of this. The biggest elephant in the room is the school districts. The charter schools are very insignificant. They basically have a little less than 2% of our student population. So that's just more informational for you right there, what it would cost.
So is this based upon the whole formula?
Yeah. When I did the formula, because I couldn't throw this in because there's no 5-year average, there's none of that for the resident. They don't have resident, they use ADMA. And so, but the formula you can see is basically similar. And the state share is over 40 years. It was based upon a flat 30% for all charter schools. And it came out to that level. So in the grand picture, the big picture of the charter schools, if they become part of this and they're funded at that level, it's not going to be a significant amount of money. Yes.
Can I ask why they're put at 30%? I mean, they don't fit in the formula.
That's in law right now, isn't it? That's in law right now.
Okay, so it's not arrived at the same way, but that's a statute.
Correct. I don't know how it got there. It's
It
the
just was a
minimum.
flat 30.
Yep, it's the minimum.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's in the law, yep.
Well, how would you figure out median family equalized property valuation and all that? That'd be a huge issue with the charter school, seeing the kids come from various districts or towns. I think that'd be a huge.
Well, that's why I asked, because it sounds crazy to try to figure that out.
Have you had inquiries from charter schools for building aid?
Yes, I'm sure that charter schools would like to, be able to fill out an application. We've had charter schools fill out an application. It's a easy add for us. I mean, like to our list. It's not like it's overwhelming. We'll get one charter school probably every once in a while that would probably put an application in. It is for the current laws is for substantial renovation and new construction. So it's not I think sometimes it's not just charter schools, public school districts too, might misunderstand what the purpose of building aid is and want to do a roof or, a window project or things like that are not eligible.
So maybe Glenn, you have more information than I do. When a charter school initiates its program and it has a site that it's in, does it get federal money for the site development or the building development, et cetera. How's that currently worked if I'm starting a charter school and let's say I don't own a building, I want to lease it, but I need to retrofit it, et cetera. What's the
There-
upfront?
There is a small lease aid.
See, that was what, you were
is-
gonna present some of the lease this morning too, weren't you? Or talk about the lease program?
Well, I can.
That's,
Yeah.
I think it'd be good that
But
you're
in-
hitting a
in-
topic we need to
yeah.
address.
In terms of the federal funding that's available, I'm not sure how much of that is available for, startup with a building. I don't think very much. I know that the building that was purchased by our local charter school that's going to be starting up, they're talking about, I think it's at least $700,000 or $800,000 in renovations. And to get started, to open the door, including ADA compliance and safety compliance with egress and so forth.
And where does that money get generated from? Obviously not from,
They're talking about having to raise it.
okay, so it's
Well, actually, I think
privately
that they're,
raised then,
yeah,
or
they're,
gifts or whatever.
they're probably going to do a mortgage, construction mortgage, and then factor into their budget that annual cost of that loan, that debt.
Glenn, are you speaking about the one in Ospey?
Yeah.
I thought they got about 1.1 million startup from federal.
Right, but I don't think that they can use that for the renovation of the building.
Okay. Thank you.
Amy,
I'll
could you
double check,
talk a
but I don't
little
think
bit
so.
about- I had spoken, I think, earlier that we have to have an understanding of the lease program. How does that work
So
from your
the,
perspective?
so the lease aid program, it does fall under RSA 19815,
Yeah.
so it falls under the building aid regulations, but they're a separate appropriation. So the building aid appropriation is to school districts that own their own building. Lease aid is to charter schools that lease buildings. And so the lease aid right now is 30% of the eligible costs in a lease, 30% each
Is it
year.
capped out at $50,000?
It's capped out at $50,000, correct. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm gonna ballpark it and say half the schools receive the full 30% and half the schools are subject to the cap. So in this new formula, you write like Academy of Science Design getting $85,000 per year. That's a really big win for them because if they were to lease a building, they'd only get 30%. $50,000, 30% up to $50,000. So Academy for Science and Design is definitely one of those that gets capped significantly by lease aid. But other charter schools are being able to pay the Department of Education through lease aid pays for that full 30%. And it's separate than building aid. So what we do is we take the appropriation and appropriate it. If we don't have enough money, then we prorate everybody at the same rate. If we ran out of money, we might only end up paying them 85% of what their award would have been because that's all the money we have. This year, we will not be doing any prorating because we have enough funds to.
How much do we appropriate a year for lease aid?
It's changed over just like the moratorium, lease aid was also not funded. I believe maybe the last 3 years, this might be our third or maybe our fourth year of funding. Again, can't promise these numbers are accurate, but I think the first year it was like $200,000 or $250,000 for lease aid. And I think we prorated everybody. We cut their payments by like 60% because it wasn't even near enough. So then the next biennium, they appropriated, I think, $500,000. And then they also increased the cap. It went from $30,000 cap to a $50,000 cap. And I think we've still had to prorate schools, maybe 90%. We were able to give them 90% of their award. And then the last 2 years, we've given about 100%.
That's a separate budget item.
It's a separate budget line item, correct. This current biennium, it's $850,000 per year that we have for lease aid. And I think the requests are somewhere near $600,000, so we had enough money.
Is this lease program just for charter schools or for districts as well?
It's just for charter schools. We don't have any school districts that
That
lease
lease property?
anyway, but it is,
Okay.
the law actually, lease aid actually covers career and technical education centers too. But the law, I don't know if it's in House Bill 2 or somewhere along the appropriation of that $850,000 says that it's only for charter schools, even though lease aid is available for career and technical education centers as well. With that said, I don't know of any career and technical education centers at least, so nobody has any heartburn over that requirement, but in the law, it's specific to charter schools. The appropriation is.
A lot to this. We heard the other day in the dissolution, we were trying to figure out, there are schools that start out leasing, but then end up buying and owning. But when the charter was initially written, there was no language for, for the possible dissolution of something eventually they owned. And so the dissolution, according to what we heard from Caitlin, is basically a boilerplate of several issues that many places are using, but there's no real definition. Am I correct, Glenn, in where I'm going with this?
I think so.
Yeah. We didn't have time to really get it. We're going to have more coming to us because this was just an organizational meeting. But
I think there's only been, of all the charters that have been granted, I think there's only been, what, 5 of them that dissolved. As I recall, thinking of this.
I couldn't honestly tell you that. There are some charters that are in trouble.
Yeah.
But in looking at these numbers of attendance that we see here, when we see school has 298 kids, call 300 kids, Seacoast, and you look at the Science Academy, they're pretty good. Micro Society Academy, those are fairly good sized schools. And their grade levels, I don't know what specifically their grade levels. Most of them don't have a high school. Most the science and design does. But so going back then, because we're going to take a break here in about 7 minutes here, so we can set up the Zoom. That's what we told the people for the ECS. They're going to come in and talk more about funding plans and possibilities for public school buildings. I guess, are there any further questions on this right now? I think we should come down and saying, do we move forward, or where are we on funding of some kind for charter schools? Are we recognizing that they do need some support, or we're already doing a lease program?
My first, sorry,
Yeah.
was I talking out of turn? I think we need to address the building aid program first before we expand it. And then once we have a system in place, then it makes sense to include charter. But we have so many buildings that are in tough shape that we have to prioritize. Just when the applications come in with the monies that we have now, they have to be prioritized.
Go ahead, Glenn.
We have a bill pending that we retain, for charter school building.
Yeah.
I think.
354.
Right, I need to address that. There's just today in, New Hampshire Business Review, an article, as charter schools expand in New Hampshire, the push is on to find more space. Enrollment numbers, policy changes are creating tensions. There is a growing number of charter schools, and I think that we have to, they're public schools, we have to support them as well.
I think we have to also define for the asset, who owns the asset? Because when you're gonna be dealing with public monies going to a private entity, unless I'm wrong, a public charter school is run by a nonprofit, independent agency.
In all the, sorry, in all the cases, today, there is the option for a district,
Right.
to do a charter school.
No question.
Right,
No question about that.
right.
In that instance, Glenn, there's no question in my mind where the facility is and who owns it. But when you've got the number that we have now, they're growing, that are in fact independent groups receiving public monies that are now going to have assets, to me, the dissolution question, the group looking at that, I'm assuming they're going to look to see where do those assets go? What does it mean to have an asset? Who owns it when it's being paid for with public monies? I mean, that is, to me, that's a threshold question that needs to be answered, I think, before we start talking about building aid, further building aid going in. I mean, it only seems logical to me to have that understanding first. Because right now, Amy, I'm assuming it's not clear who owns the asset.
I guess I would just keep in mind the way this House Bill 354 is written, that they're only getting 1/20th of the payment, like trying to mimic the term of the bond, right? So I'm trying to figure out like what would be the difference between lease aid paying every year and building aid every year to a charter school. It's not like they're getting the 80% up front like the public district schools are. So to me, it's the same risk as lease aid. You know, the lease aid they're receiving and they're paying their landlord. Where building aid, they're putting into an asset. We would have the ability, if they dissolved after 2 years, to stop paying building aid. So we would recoup 18 years we would not be paying 18 years of their building aid payment, if that makes sense. I feel like that's the reason that was in there, was to address those asset concerns.
So Amy, let's stop right there for a second. If in fact we have in law that, let's say Berlin has taken building aid for school building aid. They close school building aid down 5 years later. I understand, my reading was they got to pay back that building aid they had to improve building aid.
That is correct.
Is that the same deal with the charter schools?
That is also correct, but it's just a matter of trying to figure out how a charter school goes under, right? That if they go bankrupt, how do we actually get that money back? I'm just saying, like with a public school district, it might be easier to do. With a charter school, you might be running a little bit more risk, but is it really that much risk? Because you just essentially paid them a 1/20th payment every year, which is kind of equivalent to lease aid. You're paying a bill every year to somebody else who owns the asset. For me, I don't see with the new language. Remember, this language wasn't here when you first saw the bill, but now that this bill is in here and you're paying 1/20th of the building aid, and it also gets to kind of Representative Cascadon's concern, like about the amount of dollars that would be appropriated to that charter school. Let's say the charter school ranks higher than the public district school, and most likely they're seeking a lot less money than a public school district because they're typically smaller. But let's say they're building aid, they're seeking 1 million in building aid. We're going to be paying them $50,000 a year. So $50,000 a year is what they would be taking, whereas a public district school would be maybe seeking $40 million. Like they just don't, I don't see that as being a big threat to the building aid bucket, having charter schools there. Again, just process wise, I'm not here I'm just trying to formulate process wise. It doesn't seem like that would play a role.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't like to see charter public schools that have made the investment of buying a building be disqualified because they have put down roots. And if other schools are getting lease aid, I think that's made a step in the right direction to get a building, and I don't think they should be penalized for that.
One of the things we did have before the dissolution meeting started, I handed Tim Lang and you can look it up on the web, dissolution of charter schools in North Carolina. And there's a process in order for them to get this aid you're talking about. They have to have a plan and either the bank a guarantee that they have the substance to support if the dissolution occurs. And they have to put that up.
That's the payback that.
Yeah. And so you might want to look at what North Carolina has on the web. It's just North Carolina Charter School Dissolution. I think you should hit it. But that is certainly an issue which that committee is looking at. But if a school can do this, then why would they not be allowed to receive some support building aid as they do with lease aid? So they're putting up, are all these 501c3s?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yes, I think they are.
But,
Yeah.
right. And so there is information in Secretary of State's office under nonprofits, annual reports filed by all those corporations, also all those 501c3s.
So let's take a little break here, but we've raised some questions that when we meet again, we're going to try and get some answers coming in on the one you mentioned just right now, Mel, dissolution and the ability to pay off that debt. So what we need to do is let them come in and put this thing together. Let's just take a break and come back at about 5 minutes of 11. I think that's when they said they'd have it about ready, and we'll tap in with ECS at that time. Thank you. All right.
Do you have a copy of your women's sports LSR?
There's a gal that called my wife and from, I didn't add in that last
Yeah,
part.
right,
I can
yeah.
send that to you, what I've
Yeah.
got.
Louise Andrus with her group in Newberry,
Okay.
they filed an LSR
Okay.
with the Newberry plan.
Uh-huh.
So, I don't know, maybe if we show them yours.
I think if you go ahead and turn on your microphone, Joel and the team will be able to hear you.
Oh, okay, that's all I had to do.
Hello. Yeah.
Okay, folks, here at the committee we have here, we have ECS, and Joe Moore is here with us from ECS. He's right there on the screen. I'm Rick Ladd for folks at your end. I'm chairing the education committee here, and we're in the process of looking at school building aid. And our formula in New Hampshire is one of which it needs real good look. We're not able to fund the buildings that we need to fund currently under that model. We have with us today Amy Clark, who is from DOE. She is an engineer that's very familiar with the program and with the statutes associated with school building aid. But what we're looking at is trying to find out, are there any other states out there that might have a different way of funding this real need for having facilities that reflect what we require for instruction and curriculum in our classrooms. We have a number of buildings in our state which are well over 50 years old. And some, I hear one down in Berlin here, which representatives from, that's 90, how many years old? 98 years old. That's the building they're in. So we have a long way to go. So Joel, if you could go ahead and help us out, we'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chair Ladd, and thanks to the committee for having us. Chris, are you able to get the PowerPoint up for us? Awesome. Well, I just very briefly want to introduce ECS to the folks who may not be familiar. We are a national nonpartisan education policy center. We were created through an interstate compact back in the 1960s, and so we exist in all of the state statutes around the country, and our goal is to help all policymakers in the state, whether it's the legislature, the governor's office, department, offices of higher education or workforce development, to create better policy that works for them. Again, we are nonpartisan and non-advocacy, so we're not coming at this with any particular angle or telling you how to look at the information. Every state obviously has its own context, and you know that best for New Hampshire. But we can't tell you what the other 49 states are doing and what that looks like for them. How we do that, we've got a great policy team here that follows every bill and every rule and regulation that comes out of departments of education around the country. We track those, compile them, and regularly release research and reports. One of those that we're here to talk about today, my colleague Chris Duncombe has recently completed a 50-state comparison on how states fund school capital construction. So I will turn it over to Chris for that conversation.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Chairman Ladd. Can you hear me all right?
You're coming in fine at this end.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you all for having me here today to talk state support for school facilities.
Brian,
This is-
sit down right over there. so you
What's
can
that?
see. No, I was just asking another member to sit down where he could see the screen. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me here today. This is a topic area that we've seen a lot of interest recently from state leaders, so happy to share some of our recent research on this topic area. People tend to think of school facilities as largely just a local responsibility, but states can and do play a significant role in building and maintaining school facilities. So today I'm going to touch on a few topic areas. First is just some initial context. I'm going to provide some background on revenues and who pays for school construction and how New Hampshire compares to other states. Then I'll share findings from the research we completed that Joel mentioned on our first 50 state comparison on K-12 school construction and the types of financial assistance that states provide, as well as going through some of the key design choices that states have in determining that financial assistance. And then finally, Chairman Ladd, in our initial conversations, I heard some interest in allocation methods. So I'm going to provide a couple state examples that may be helpful as you're looking to perhaps change your model in New Hampshire. So in terms of revenue sources nationally, as you all are probably familiar, state governments are the largest source of operating K-12 support. They surpassed local governments in the 1980s. States play a smaller but still a significant role in K-12 capital expenditures. They contribute 22% of all costs, which is equal to an average annual outlay of $54 billion. You'll notice if you see the time periods on this slide that for capital expenditures, that's averaged over an 11-year period, and that's because capital expenses are much more prone to variation, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail soon. So it's averaged over a longer period, so it's not skewed by one particular year of large or new investment. There's also substantial state-to-state variation, so state context really does matter. For example, 10 states provide more than 50% of capital costs, and that includes New Hampshire and many of your New England neighbors, including Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Meanwhile, other states provide less than that, and some states provided no capital construction aid, and it was required entirely a local responsibility. So it really does vary. For New Hampshire, to show the data on revenue sources, New Hampshire is somewhat unique in that on the operating side, most of the revenue sources come from local sources, and this local reliance is likely due, in fact, New Hampshire does not collect a personal income tax on wages or salaries or a statewide general sales tax. The state does play a larger role in funding capital expenditures. The state funded over half of the capital costs from 2009 to 2019, and that compares quite favorably to the national data I shared on the previous slide, showing that states on average provided just 22% of the costs. The data, if you're interested in, is from the operating side is on National Center of Education Statistics. On the capital side is from the 21st Century School Fund State of Our Schools report. And I have that linked in the resources slide at the end of this presentation if you're interested in getting more information on funding and funding sources. Funding does not only vary from state to state, but it also varies over time. Capital construction funding is very volatile. The graph I have on the slide provides inflation-adjusted data from the U.S. Census Bureau's annual survey of school system finances. The performance of the economy results in much larger swings in capital funding from both states and local governments compared to operating expenses on facility maintenance that you see in the slide. Following the 07-09 recession, capital expenditures dropped 26%, while maintenance and operations support declined to 6%. And so that's not to say that a 6% decline is nothing. This drop can have significant budgetary impacts, but it's not the more extreme variation that occurs on the capital spending side. Similarly, during more recent economic growth, capital expenditures have increased dramatically, and part of the reason why I think we've heard so much from state leaders on this topic area rising 27%, where maintenance and operations support has stayed fairly stable. And I provide this information just as for a financial planning note, especially with concerns about a fiscal cliff with the expiration of federal relief dollars and potential for a downturn in the economy at some point. So going into the research that we've completed at ECS, we provide these 50 state comparisons to give leaders a national landscape on what we kind of identify as some of the key decision points. This is the first year we've done the capital construction 50 state comparison. So if there's any gaps that you identify, if you get a chance to take a look at the database to the information I share today, we're certainly open to suggestions and we're improving or refining it. From a high level, we found that 90% of states provide some role in supporting school construction, either through appropriating funds directly to districts or by providing some type of financing support. The research also made clear that state leaders have a lot of different decisions to consider in providing that support, such as how to prioritize projects, whether there's a dedicated revenue source, if a state or a separate authority finances projects, if voter approval is required for state or local debt issuance, or if there's an incentive for consolidation projects. And this diversity of funding approaches does create an opportunity for states to potentially learn from one another, and that's what we hope this 50 state comparison can be helpful in doing. We have the full databases on our website, ecs.org, and we're happy to share any data points of interest directly with the committee. Before going further, I did want to clarify some of the differences in the terms that I'm using. When I say appropriations and financing support, appropriations refer to funds distributed to school districts, often through a categorical grant program outside of their primary funding formula. And these dollars can be used for upfront costs or paying off locally issued debt. The distinction here is the state does not require repayment. Financing support is state assistance that can take the form of bond issuance, guaranteeing locally issued bonds, or loaning money to districts from a state revolving loan fund, and the distinction being the state requires full or partial repayment. In terms of what we found that 10 states provide, and I will note that this is based upon our view of statutory language and the most recently enacted budget. So that's not to say that states have not done things differently in the past, but this is what we found from current policy. We found that 10 states provide appropriations, but do not provide financing support, as you see on the slide. 7 states and DC provide financing, but do not appropriate funds directly to districts. And 28 states, including New Hampshire, provide both appropriations and financing support. And 5 states that we identified for the most recently enacted budget did not provide either. So overall, that's 90% of states providing some form of financial assistance. Going into some of the design choices that we flagged as potentially of interest as states are looking to design their school construction aid. One of the most important roles that we thought the state could play in this is to try to equalize wealth disparities across districts. It's the same with operational funding. The state can play a role in equalizer in supporting capital construction costs, and they do that by factoring in local ability to pay. States use this factor to prioritize which projects are receiving funds, the amount that they're eligible to receive, or both. New Hampshire has an index that what is the name of that index? Sorry, the wealthy. Your building aid factor has an equal valuation per pupil and median income included in it. So you all do have an ability to pay. A lot of states take a few variety of approaches in this. The most common is an assessed property value per student, which is included in your school building aid factor. Now, almost every state with wealth equalization has this included as at least an element of their local ability to pay measure. States also factor in a few other items such as household income. New Hampshire has median household income, or child poverty rates, or the percentage of students receiving free or reduced price meals, levels of indebtedness compared to property values, unemployment rates, and Nevada factors in declining property values, which is a unique measure. Another key decision that we saw in designing this aid is to deal with the volatility that I shared earlier. Some states may dedicate funding for school construction other than general funds, as general funds may not be dedicated to school construction in tough economic times, as there may be more pressing and immediate needs that require the use of those funds. So one strategy is to try to provide some stability by dedicating a revenue source. We identified 19 states that have a dedicated revenue source, the most common being lottery proceeds or taxes on casino gaming. 6 states that we identified did that. States may also use a sales and use tax as another common source, and this could be dedicating the state share or local share of sales tax. States may also provide a local option to raise sales tax for school construction. I don't have them on this slide, but both Virginia and Georgia have that as an option. Other common revenue sources include severance taxes on natural resources for a lot of the energy-rich states, or revenue from taxes on marijuana sales, whether that's medical or recreational. And the last examples being fees collected from either licensing fees or on criminal fines, fees, and forfeitures. Another challenge facing school districts is maintaining too many rather than too few school facilities. Given the changing demographics across the country, it's also being experienced in New Hampshire with declining student populations. This is an increasing challenge. We identified 29 states that provide a financial incentive for districts to consolidate. The most common was some type of a hold harmless provision, usually that lasting 1 to 5 years, saying that consolidated district can't get less per student than they would have received if the 2 districts had remained separate. States also prioritize and provide additional dollars for construction projects. New Hampshire provides additional per student dollar allocations for cooperative school districts, so not consolidated, but districts that are sharing services. Some states may also provide an additional weight through their formula to boost support. Another example that we saw was states offering the lower of the 2 ability to pay measures for the 2 consolidating districts. So the state would take on a larger share of costs for a certain period, usually similar to lasting as the hold harmless policies. And Arizona is unique and they have different local revenue limits for consolidated districts. Another approach that states have taken, including New Hampshire, is to establish a separate authority to provide oversight and management of debt specific to school construction and to issue debt that is not at the full faith and credit of the state. We identified at least 16 states, and not all authorities provide full faith and credit outside of the state, but some do. We identified at least 16 states that have established these authorities, including New Hampshire School Building Authority. Other states provide financing support, do so through a department at the state, typically the Department of Revenue or the state treasurer. And other states just have local financing to construct projects. Some of the takeaways in doing this research that I wanted to share for the trend of those high effort states that we saw, based on the states that are spending the most from the 21st Century School Funds database, and what we found in our research, the states being Alaska, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Ohio, Wyoming, is that they shared some common features. They typically have a grant that's available to district that takes into local ability to pay. The state issues bonds to finance projects at lower interest costs than districts would be able to obtain on their own. And some have established a separate financing authority. And then finally, a dedicated revenue to provide some stability compared to general fund appropriations. So I'm going to go into the last topic there, and then happy to have more of a discussion. And In terms of allocation methods, state allocation approaches can be really quite complex. Some states have multiple grants with very different approaches that add to that complexity. So in an effort to simplify, I placed these approaches in two really large categories: allocations that are driven by formula and allocations that are driven by an application process. Formula allocations are specified in state law or the state budget. In our 50-state comparison, we identified a variety of formula-driven allocations. The states may factor in local ability to pay, which I had mentioned previously, and those are typically identified by formula. States may also distribute or determine how much funding is available for particular projects based on formula. That may factor in enrollment of number of students that are served by a project that is being proposed. They may also factor in square footage of the project or cost per square footage. They can be quite simple. In Idaho, a single dollar amount is allocated per student to all districts based on their attendance counts, or they can be quite complex. Maryland's capital improvement program allocates aid on enrollment projections, baseline square footage, cost per square foot, and local ability to pay. States also allocate funds based on a competitive application process. And this is where the state designates an agency or a separate body to review applications and award funds. The review process can have a degree of subjectivity in which the reviewing body is given a list of priorities and is told to allocate funds based on those priorities, or it can have a more objective, clearly defined scoring processes. And I'll offer a few state examples that I've seen in doing the database. North Carolina is one example. They have two separate grant programs, both funded by lottery revenues. The first, the Public School Capital Funds, is a program funded annually with $100 million from lottery revenues that's required in state statute that deposit, and is allocated to all the school districts in the state and is based off solely on average daily membership. They also have a needs-based capital funds, and districts must apply to receive these grants. The eligibility to receive them is based on assessed property values. The adjusted market value of taxable property must be less than $40 billion to be eligible. And in that application process, the North Carolina Department of Instruction reviews applications and prioritizes based on a set list of criteria. That includes debt to tax ratios, whether the project is addressing critical deficiencies in adequately serving student populations, whether it's a consolidation project, whether the district has received one of these grants previously, and a few other criteria. Another example is New Mexico. New Mexico created a council to assist districts in applying for construction grants and to review and award funds. Membership on the council is specified in statute, has 9 members, includes the governor, their designee, superintendent of public construction, and a variety of executive and legislative appointments. The council has a more sophisticated approach for awarding funds than, I don't know, maybe not sophisticated is the right word, but a more formulated approach to awarding funds. They rely on a facilities assessment database to prioritize applications. This database is populated with information that is gathered through capital master plans submitted by districts to the state and by field assessments to determine school deficiencies. The council uses the applications based on the information collected in the database to create a facility index condition, and that index ranks all the project applications, and that is how they determine how to award funds. So I would say this is a slightly more rigorous application-based approach for awarding funds. So I'll leave you with some of the resources that I've mentioned, and we'll send this also to the subcommittee so that you have all the access to all this information. And thank you for listening to me go through these slides, and I'm happy to have a bit more of a conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. That's informative. It's a broad picture. Right now, from the committee, are there any questions or need for additional information you may have heard from Chris from the presentation? I have a question just to start it out with. Under the allocation methods, you mentioned that Idaho has a single dollar amount which they allocate each year based upon, it must be average daily membership that in residence or something such as that. How do they take into account, how would they take into account the needs that a high school may have, need for more space, more square footage than a grade school? So we've had some discussion regarding funding based upon population, student enrollment. I guess the question is, has that allocation process run into any problems with the needs of specific buildings for different age levels?
Thank you, Chairman. That's a great question. And we did see a lot of states that factor in grade level in their allocation of project amounts. I can go through and grab a few examples of those states and provide them to you. Idaho actually has, I mentioned one of their grants. They have 2 grants that they provide. That first grant is allocated just on average daily attendance. They use attendance as opposed to enrollment to count students, so it's an attendance count. And it's a flat amount, so it does not vary based upon student grade level. But they also have a separate grant that is kind of similar to North Carolina, where I mentioned they have this enrollment driven and this needs based, and then they also have a needs based grant that is available to eligible districts. I don't believe that grant either takes into account grade level, but that is a factor that some states have done. Seeing if I can find an example. Arizona is a state that does that. Arkansas, California, Delaware, Florida. So there's quite a few examples of states that are taking into account grade level, and I can provide that complete list and additional information on those states to members of the committee.
So that's basically you're talking about your average daily membership, but they're also taking into account how many are in middle school, how many are in elementary school, how many are in the high school? And so would they be funded at different levels based upon the school grade level they may be in? Like we have about 32% of our kids are high school kids. The remainder, of course, all K through 8.
Yeah, some states will have more complex formulas, so I don't think it's as straightforward as a single different dollar amount per grade level, but it is factored into the formula, so it will eventually impact the overall dollar amount that is allocated for a project. And states may also factor in grade level in their ranking of projects.
Okay. Are there other questions for Chris right now? Yes, Representative Dry?
Thank you. That was really well presented. Thank you very much. Do you take charter schools into account? Because that's the reason we're here today. Does that affect any of these other states?
I'm sorry, Representative, did you ask about charter schools and their eligibility to receive funds?
Yeah, how does that factor in the other 49 states?
I've seen in some of states that are explicit and charter schools are ineligible, and some states where charter schools are eligible. Oklahoma's Rosebud grants are an example. This is a grant program they established recently that's funded through medical marijuana sales that's allocated to districts and is allocated off of their equalization method. And charter schools are eligible to receive those grants. That is the one that came up in the database that we did, but there may be other state examples where charters are eligible.
Thank you.
Yes, Representative Luno.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thanks so much for presenting to us this morning. is there a way that we can also have an ability to compare New Hampshire charter school structure with charter schools from other states? Because my understanding is that New Hampshire has very specific corporate structure surrounding charters that may vary from, maybe different from that of other states. And for example, some charters in New Hampshire could be chartered by the local school district. We have none, I think, currently that fall into that category.
We have no charter conversions.
That's what I'm saying, yeah, none. So the charters that we do have are private corporation charters, and but they're New Hampshire corporations, I believe. But I think the charters in New Hampshire are very different than, for example, the charters in Massachusetts. Am I correct on that, Rick?
I couldn't compare it to Matt, I don't know.
But so if we were to say, look at how, and I'm just picking for the sake of discussion, how Massachusetts funds building construction for their charters, that might be different than what New Hampshire does because of the way their charters are incorporated. Is there a way that we'd be able to be able to dig down to that level of detail and really understand what we're getting into?
Thank you, Representative. Yes, that is a great question. And charter schools, their structure, how they're authorized, many of their policies varies a ton state to state. We do a 50-state comparison on charter school policies that we completed fairly recently. I can send that to you, but I can also reach out to the author of that report to see if a particular state jumped out to him in the completion of that report as a good comparison state, as a state that you're looking for, a state that has charters organized similarly to New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. But even ones that organize differently, understanding what components of their building aid program may rely on the differences in those, in those other states, and whether or not we would want to consider including those components or not. But I think that would all be very helpful if the chair.
Yes, I'll just as context, the information we have on funding for charter schools in that report has information on how funding is determined, who provides the funding, does the state provide startup or planning grants, and what kind of facilities funding is available. Yeah. So there is a facilities component in that as well.
That would be great. And I think for background, I think there is a study ongoing here in New Hampshire with respect to charter dissolution because of their private corporation status, and I don't know if that's the same as in other states. But how would, I mean, I'm from the business background, and contracts always seem to be about not when the marriage is running great, but when things start to come to the end, come to disintegrate, and that's when the contract language starts coming out. But what happens in that type of situation, particularly with investment of public money in these privately owned facilities?
And you weren't here earlier today, Dave, but there is one state which we had charter school dissolution information. We didn't go into it today. It's North Carolina.
Okay, great.
And they have certain criteria that you have to have written into your charter before you're going to get the state loan or money.
Right.
That's how that can be dealt with.
No, that's excellent information, Rick, and I think that goes to what one of the things you were talking about during the session too, about having specific information that's expected in these agreements, that these charters, but also co-op agreements and things like that don't have a lot of standard to them right now.
Chris, one other area that we are hearing from our administrators out in the school districts is that the predictability of when I can receive these dollars is based upon, of course, legislation, what we appropriate here annually or biannually. This previous year, we had, and Amy, you're here behind the screen, but are you having that side? We had 17 districts applying for revenue from the state for building aid. We've approved at this point 2 and possibly another one coming. But the issue is that these school districts, in order to get an application into the department, have to jump a lot of hoops, financial hoops in terms of site plans, architect fees, all that. And of course, they have to go to their local taxpayers, the person in the community, to raise those dollars. And then they're one of those that didn't get money this given year or this biennium. So they're down $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 for the engineering fees. It's probably a whole lot more than that. It's probably $300,000. And so they never get reimbursed for that, seeing the projects are just going on to the list the subsequent year, and they may not be rated highly or not. So it's kind of a crapshoot. So predictability of resources to the school districts really important. So what we were looking at just in discussing earlier today is having a flat amount of money appropriated based upon a formula annually, which would be then put into a state account, and the school districts could not access that funding until such time that they had their application approved by the department and it dealt with either renovation or construction. And we also had a thought maybe it could be used also to pay off previous debt. So are there any other states that have similar type logic towards how to set up a formula as I just mentioned?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I was actually, as you were talking, thinking that having some guaranteed grant amount could be approached to providing stability, in addition to, as I mentioned, having a designated revenue source other than general funds. In terms of other states with that approach, I mentioned Idaho has that flat amount, which perhaps why you inquired about Idaho. Again, it's not as sophisticated as what you're talking about in terms of differentiating by need or school type. And I don't believe that money is held in a reserve account, but it's just allocated annually so that there is a dependable source of some revenue that's coming to districts. In terms of other states that award funds without an application that's required or prior to an application being submitted, Kentucky does that as well. Let me see. Sorry, it's just a lot of information to store from 50 states and very complex policies to have available at recall on a moment's notice. So they also use average daily attendance. And it's just $100 payment based on ADA or average daily attendance. I can try to see if I can find another state that has an example that's kind of similar to what you're describing. Maybe that, as opposed to just giving you all the states that factor in grade level, I can look for another example that better matches what you're describing to me. But I do think that type of approach is a logical one for trying to provide some stability to districts so that they can handle some of these initial costs for getting a project going, especially if there's no certainty that they will receive approval from the state to be funded.
We did see that Tennessee had a program where it's similar to what I stated right here, where they have a certain amount of money which they allocate based upon their attendance plus also on the square footage per student per type of building they're in, middle school, high school. Also like to know what's the life cycle that they're expecting. We've heard from Amy right here, it's about 40 years. Is that pretty typical throughout the country? And how do we factor in things like the fees and construction costs or debt retirement into this formula?
Thank you, Chairman. For debt retirement, I believe that you were proposing, was it 20-year?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that 20 and 30 were the two, that was the typical length that we saw in reviewing states. So that would fall within that period, 20-year being the most common.
Okay.
In terms of life cycle analysis, I don't know if we captured all of that through statutory language, but in looking into New Mexico's example of the database that they use, that index does pull in information on life cycle analysis for the projects to determine whether it'd be more costly to replace or refurbish the school. And so I think that perhaps providing more information on that New Mexico's database information to you might be informative if you're interested in life cycle information.
Mm-hmm. Anything we can get, we're appreciating. Amy, do you have any questions or thoughts, seeing that this is your arena?
I don't have any specific questions.
Okay. Are there any questions from the committee? Yes, Dave?
Thanks very much, Rick, and thanks again, Chris. And I may have missed this when you were speaking earlier, but are any states, and this is speaking generally to building aid, doing what New Hampshire's doing, which is a all upfront type payment to the school district? Or you were mentioning that a lot, we're doing 20 and 30 year, more 20-year amortizations.
Yeah, we identified, sorry, thank you, Representative. We identified that states were either providing their appropriations as a direct grant that helps cover upfront costs, and that can be done all upfront or a series of payments, or as a debt reimbursement, and it's pretty split. We found that it was actually more states were using a direct grant aid or a combination. We found 25 states that had direct grant aid that was helping to cover some of the upfront costs. 7 states that used both direct grant aid and debt reimbursement, and 6 states that only were doing it through debt reimbursement process. So more states were kind of similar to New Hampshire as opposed to just doing the debt reimbursement process where they're just paying off annually of locally issued debt, and they have an amortization schedule that is paying off those costs.
Okay. No, that's good. And I want to make sure I was clear on the question too, that when I talk about upfront, I'm not talking about necessarily upfront costs or soft costs associated with the project. Really talking about that if a project has been approved for $10 million in state building aid grant, that essentially that $10 million gets paid. I forgot what it is in New Hampshire, 80%.
80% upfront.
80% upfront, and then 20% on completion of the building,
Yes.
which may be 10 months later, but it's essentially all up. It's upfront as opposed to trickling out in 20 payments, as you say, to help the district cover cost of bonded debt.
Yeah, the 80% might be a bit high. Well, I was answering those 25 states are not paying over the full length of the loan. They're paying in a series of installments. It could be primarily upfront, like you're saying, New Hampshire, or 5 to 10 payments over a few years. But it's not done throughout the life cycle of the entire loan. That's the debt reimbursement model that I mentioned
Okay,
that
okay.
fewer states are doing.
All right, so it doesn't have to be synchronous with the term of the bond, but could be done
It could be much
in an
spread out
accelerated, yeah,
as the costs are being spent by the districts.
right. Okay, great. Thanks, Chris.
Well, what about going further with this now? So what about paying less upfront, to the school district so we have more money to incorporate more projects? That's another avenue we could take.
And I like what Chris has suggested too. It doesn't necessarily have to be synchronized with the term of the bond, but maybe if it's a $10 million project, or sorry, a $10 million grant, that's paid out $2 million a year over 5 years. And so that would give the district some flexibility in terms of how they want to go, the terms of paying off the bond
Yeah, that
as
would.
well, and allow us to do more projects too.
Yeah. I got one other question here for you. We do utilize to support those communities which may have less of an economic ability, high property taxes, et cetera, we use median family income / equalized property value, our valuation of property. So with that, we have some districts get 30% of the construction cost. Others may get 60%. We find even with some that are communities which don't really have the economic strength, the 60% is even a tough, because then the locals have to come up with that 40%, and these costs today of buildings, if we're talking $30 million for the building, you don't see it happening, or the bond doesn't get approved on the local level. Do you have some knowledge of states that may go above the 60% that we do, and maybe going from 30 to 80% or 20 to 80%, widening that out a little bit so that we can help the poorer towns?
Yeah, Connecticut is, I'm sorry, thank you, Chairman. Connecticut's 20 to 80% of project
Okay,
costs.
Connecticut is.
There are, I'm going to see if there's other examples of it going above 70%. There's typically a range with a floor and a maximum.
You said Connecticut was 20 to 80? Yeah.
Yeah, 20% to 80% is the range of state share.
Oh.
That's Rick, that's interesting too, because that 20 to 80, obviously, a factor of 4 there in terms of a grant factor, but it's very consistent with equalized valuation ranges too, and which is fiscal capacity. Yeah,
That's exactly
that's
right.
very interesting.
It's something that maybe we want to look at.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that before, haven't you, Amy? Of going up to 80% possibly? Yeah.
Amy, that rings a bell.
It does, and it's not that we're striving for 100%, but Maine does provide close to 100% of all of their construction projects. Just trying to give a context of whether it's reasonable to go up to 80%.
Oh, that's great.
Are there any other, questions of Chris right now? Chris, is this, Jen, do we have a copy of the PowerPoint that was just showed us, or?
He said he was gonna share it with the
Okay.
subcommittee after.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Chris, I don't think we have any other questions here at this time, but we'll stay in touch. We would like to look at some of this information. We definitely are in a process where we've been allocating funds out based upon a formula that's been around for a long, long time. And there's debt out there too, of which if we appropriate in a given year at currently $50 million, half of that's going to go pay off debt that we're obligated to pay off. So it doesn't leave a whole lot, but in the same time, we're trying to put in place a formula that's going to allow us to sort of get away from this process which we have and give more predictability and sustainability to the formula. So that's, I guess, where we are, and it's a challenge. The challenge is trying to transition from where we've been to where we got to go, because the dollars are going to have to be appropriated, some sizable dollars.
And we've got a pretty deep backlog.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah, we got a lot of old buildings out there and buildings that need replacement. So with that.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. Well, Joel, we really appreciate it. And of course, we have Gen 4 here that works with you quite often. And so if we have some questions, we'll work through Jen to give you some, any communications we may have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And as y'all go through the legislative session, we're always here. So please keep us in mind.
Good to see you, Joel.
Good.
Thanks
See
a
y'all.
lot.
Have a good day.
Yeah, have a good one.
Bye.
Thank you. So we've gone through quite a bit today. We're at the end of this one. But I think we also have to find out about the disillusionment process for the charter schools. So we're going to have to get a hold of Senator Lang. He's now chairing that committee. And that's all we did was organize. So, but we got to go from there.
I think we have 2 meetings set up.
What were the 2 dates of that? I didn't write them down.
September, October?
October, I think,
September,
what was September?
September 20, October 4th, I definitely have.
Yeah.
The October 4th. I thought there was September 29th also, but I don't see it on the calendar. I might not have added it.
Yeah, I didn't either. I'll have to contact his office. Well, I guess there's a lot of information here. I'd like everybody to try to look at that spreadsheet that was given out and see, because that has some pluses, of course, has some minuses as well, as we've spoken to. But in the how to apply something like that even to the charter schools, because we're working off of ADMR, they would have to work off ADMA. And we have a 5-year average, probably be a 1-year average for those which are owned. Yes.
So just in listening, I've heard that maybe our 114 square feet and our price is low. Is it worth reworking this with higher numbers?
Yeah, you can take that spreadsheet we have. It's an Excel spreadsheet, so it's one you can plug in, cost per square foot. You can put square foot that's required for grade levels in. You can change it from a life cycle of 40 years to 30 years. By changing the life cycle from 40 to 30 years, you up it by another $10 million with all the other constants remaining constant. But you could change the factors for, how much we're going to put in there for equipment or architectural fees or debt retirement. That can all change.
I guess my point is, those are variables.
Yeah.
But these are 2 things that I've heard today. We may just have started at a too low a point to look at a good comparison.
Yeah. The reason why I selected those figures is I took and did what was being done in that one state of Tennessee. Then I took a calculator with inflation costs, or what a dollar was back then, what it would be worth now. It doesn't do what Amy would look at, actual construction costs. Well, they were initially, but that can all change. But we got to also calculate in here, you're going to have to pay for, you're going to have that flat amount coming into the districts annually. You're going to have to pay off our debt as well. And then you're going to have money that's available that's going to be taking care of these projects that come up that are emergencies that you're not aware of. And we could be talking about initially there, we appropriate supposedly $50 million a year. It's going to jump almost twice that, or a significant hunk to pay off our debt and also get that money flowing in to put the money in the flat amount which they would receive. And that would change too annually based upon demographics, based upon cost of construction. And like Amy said, we might want to use not just some of this money, not just for construction and renovation, but also paying off debt that the district currently owns, which is not a bad idea as well. So a lot to it. It's going to take us time to do it, but we need to be looking at this stuff.
Could I just add to Chairman that I would encourage you to use accurate representative numbers. And then if you need to make the dollar come out to something that's reasonable, then you work with the percentages so that the community can effectively communicate that the state is not indeed paying 60%, they're indeed paying 32% or something, because it allows for better communications. Because if those numbers are not reasonable, then it really sets the school district up for not really being able to communicate with their community very well.
Okay. I can share with everybody where I got some of those figures initially. They came from this sheet, which I got from Tennessee. But be aware that we do have another bill coming at us from the Senate, which is going to be looking at this similar type model, but based solely on ADM. Okay, I guess we're right at noontime. So, anything else? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you very much. I knew you'd ask. See, it's not in the calendar because they had to reschedule it from, what was last Friday, Thursday? It would have been last Thursday's meeting. What's the one we have this afternoon? Okay, yeah, that's right. It's ADMA. It's the one where